Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Betrayal, How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America, by Ira Shapiro, narrated by Paul Bellantoni. Under our Constitution, there are simply not that many people who are in a position to do something about an executive branch in chaos. Too often we observe the unfolding drama along with the rest of the country, passively, all but saying, somebody should do something, without seeming to realize that that someone is us. Senator Jeff Flake, My Party is in Denial About Donald Trump, Politico, July 31st, 2017. I don't think they, the founders, suspected we could have a rogue president and a rogue leader in the Senate at the same time. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, December 19th, 2019. He who rides the tiger cannot choose where he dismounts. Under Secretary of State George Ball, dissenting from the escalation of America's engagement in Vietnam, 1964. Preface. This is the story of the most catastrophic failure of government in American history. This failure undermined the rule of law and threatened our constitutional rights. It deepened our divisions, pitting red states against blue states, whites against blacks. It endangered our national security, weakening our alliances and strengthening our adversaries. It produced unprecedented economic hardship, throwing millions of hard-working Americans into poverty and despair. It caused many thousands of Americans to die needlessly before their time. It led directly to the insurrection at the Capitol. It was the failure of the United States Senate, from January 2017 to February 2021. Most American history is written about the presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, the Roosevelts, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Reagan, or great events like the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II, and Vietnam. Donald Trump's aberrational presidency has already been the subject of more than 1,200 books. At least 1,200 more will emerge in the years to come. People here and around the world will ask how America, the greatest power in the world, elevated to the presidency a celebrity reality TV star with no experience in government, whose tumultuous business record, deeply flawed personality, abuse of women, and hatred of minorities were all plainly visible. I am quite certain that Trump will be judged harshly. His mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, his refusal to acknowledge the 2020 election results, and his incitement of the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021 are likely to make him the most reviled person in our country's history, even more so than other failed or discredited presidents, criminals, assassins, or traitors. There was never any basis for believing that he would govern competently or that he cared about doing so. Still, Trump accomplished what appears to be his life's goal. He became the most famous person in the world. But in the American constitutional system, no one person, not even the president, is supposed to be able to undermine our institutions and jeopardize our democracy. The framers of the Constitution wanted a strong central government, because the weakness of the Articles of Confederation showed the limits of what the states could accomplish on their own. But, having fought the American Revolution to free the colonies from Great Britain and its monarch, our founders feared the possibility of an overreaching executive who would seek to become a king or an autocrat. They also feared that a president might be corrupt, pursuing personal gain instead of the national interest, and that he could be susceptible to powerful foreign influences. Consequently, the founders designed a system of checks and balances, the most distinctive feature of which was the Senate. They made it the strongest upper house in the world, with the power to advise and consent on executive and judicial nominations, to ratify treaties, and to hold impeachment trials. Robert C. Byrd, the longest-serving senator and its most dedicated historian, who understood the Senate's potential and hated when it failed to reach that mark, wrote that The American Senate was the premier spark of brilliance that emerged from the collective intellect of the Constitution's framers. James Madison, characteristically, cut to the heart of things in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1787. He called the Senate the great anchor of the government. Such an institution may be sometimes necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. The Senate would be assigned many functions, but it had one fundamental responsibility: to be a bulwark against any leader who would abuse the great powers of the presidency in ways that threatened our democracy. Some 230 years later, when just such a president finally reached the White House, the Senate should have been democracy's strongest line of defense. Instead, a nightmare scenario followed. The Senate, weakened from a long period of accelerating decline, proved utterly incapable of checking Trump's authoritarian desires. Sometimes the Senate aided and abetted Trump. Often it simply stood by and allowed him to rampage unchecked. America had no defense against the novel threat presented by the unholy alliance between Trump and the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, in a moment of anger, correctly observed that the founders had not contemplated the combination of a rogue president and a rogue majority leader. The magnitude of the Senate's failure should be clearly understood. The Senate did not fail because of its arcane rules or because of the abuse of the filibuster. It did not fail because its members lacked the ability to do their jobs. It did not fail because the senators missed the danger signs. The overwhelming majority of the Senate knew that Trump was incompetent, corrupt, and dangerous. Indeed, many saw him as a witting or unwitting agent of Vladimir Putin. No, the Senate failed because its Republican members, led by McConnell, abandoned the late Senator John McCain's guiding principle: country first. When it mattered most, the Republican senators put their personal political interests first, the Republican Party's interests second, and the country's interests nowhere. As America faced unprecedented, cascading, intersecting crises, the Republican senators chose to stand with Trump, either actively supporting him or silently acquiescing. Some undoubtedly convinced themselves that Trump would wither away or that they would find an exit ramp. But, as George Ball, the State Department official who famously dissented from the escalation of the Vietnam War, observed, "He who rides the tiger cannot choose where he dismounts." The litany of failures on the part of Mitch McConnell's Senate is striking. In July 2018, in Helsinki, when Trump accepted Vladimir Putin's denial that Russia had interfered in the 2016 presidential election, dismissing the consensus of the U.S. intelligence community, the Senate Republicans collectively shrugged. In April 2019, when Attorney General William Barr blatantly mischaracterized the report of Special Counsel Robert Mueller as having exonerated Trump from the charge of obstructing justice, key senators, led by McConnell, quickly claimed "case closed," rather than questioning what Barr had done. In January 2020, the Senate's first impeachment trial of Trump, a solemn responsibility, only the third impeachment trial of a president in history, proved to be an utter farce. The Senate Republicans refused to subpoena relevant documents and key witnesses. Led by the respected Senator Lamar Alexander, they justified their Potemkin Village trial by saying it was an election year, so the voters should pass judgment on Trump's presidency. They exonerated Trump without even censuring him. But when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in September 2020, the Senate Republicans quickly forgot about the voters, moving with unseemly speed to ram through the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett 8 days before Election Day, even after millions of votes in the presidential election had already been cast. In November 2020, after every media organization had confirmed that Joe Biden had secured more than the 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency, the Senate Republicans refused to acknowledge Biden's victory until all the votes were counted, ignoring the fact that enough votes had been counted to guarantee the outcome, and all legal appeals, no matter how frivolous, were ruled on. When Trump and his lawyers had lost 61 cases, every case they brought, the Republican senators decided that Biden could not be president-elect until the Electoral College met on December 14th. When the electors met, did their duty, and confirmed Biden's 306 to 232 electoral vote victory, most of the Senate Republicans finally acknowledged that Biden was the president-elect, but some continued to fight on. Even on January 6th, when the Congress met for the ceremonial purpose of accepting the Electoral College vote, Senator Josh Hawley and 11 other Republican senators forced both houses of Congress to debate the issue of whether Biden had won. In all these ways, they created the occasion for Trump to invite his supporters to attack the Capitol. With several notable exceptions, these Senate failures implicate virtually all the Republican senators during the Trump presidency. But, in the words of the Sicilian proverb, "A fish rots from the head," the story of the Senate's rot is first and foremost the story of Mitch McConnell. He was an unyielding obstructionist during the Obama presidency, culminating in his refusal to hold a vote on Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, following the death of Justice Antonin Scalia in February 2016. In contrast, McConnell became a relentless battering ram with Trump in the White House. He rode roughshod over one Senate custom, norm, and tradition after another. After Trump shocked the world by winning the presidency, America urgently needed a strong Senate, with a leader in the mold of Democratic Mike Mansfield or Republican Howard Baker, politicians who are rightly remembered as great statesmen and patriots. Instead, America got McConnell, a superb political strategist and tactician who was extraordinarily effective in achieving his partisan objectives, at great cost to the Senate and the country that depended on it. Of course, even McConnell, the most powerful Senate leader in history, could not have done what he did without his troops. Throughout the Trump presidency, McConnell had only a very narrow majority with which to work. At any moment, 3 or 4 Republicans could have stopped him in his tracks. This happened exactly once, in July 2017, when John McCain, dying of brain cancer, memorably joined Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski in defeating McConnell's brazen attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act without hearings, committee action, or floor debate. But McConnell was never thwarted again. Just as McConnell enabled Trump, the other Senate Republicans enabled McConnell. With the exception of Mitt Romney, who cast the only Republican vote to remove Trump from office in the first impeachment trial, all the Republican senators were complicit. The shameless Lindsey Graham, who had been John McCain's best friend and Donald Trump's most scathing critic, spun 180 degrees to become Trump's favorite golf partner and McConnell's wingman. Less obvious, and simply shameful, Lamar Alexander and Rob Portman, 2 superb public servants, became virtually invisible at every moment when their voices and their stature would have been useful to call attention to Trump's abuses of the presidential office. The reality of this breakdown was widely acknowledged. On February 25, 2020, in the tiny window between the end of Trump's first impeachment trial and the onset of the pandemic, 70 retired senators, including 17 Republicans and 4 independents, joined in a letter published in the Washington Post that stated, "The Senate is failing to perform its constitutional duties." One sentence in the letter leaped out. "We have been told by sitting senators that the diminished state of the Senate has left them doubting whether there is any point in continuing to serve." Others, like New Mexico Senator Tom Udall, concurred that the Senate is broken, but attributed the brokenness to hyper-partisanship, the shrill cable news cycle, the permanent campaign in which there is never any time to govern, and the harsh politics of personal destruction, usually credited to the rise of Newt Gingrich in the 1980s and 1990s, and intensified by the advent of Twitter and Facebook as major outlets for political discourse. All these factors are real, but they do not add up to the right explanation. The Senate failed because Mitch McConnell and his Republican caucus repeatedly and deliberately took actions they knew to be wrong and failed to take actions they knew to be right. They averted their eyes as Trump lied about COVID-19, hawked fake cures for the virus, and mocked masks and social distancing, a deluge of misinformation that caused thousands of needless deaths. They opted for silence when Trump invited his supporters to indoor rallies in the midst of the pandemic. They refused to act when Trump attempted to bribe foreign governments with military aid in exchange for campaign assistance. They stood by silently as Trump cast aspersions on the military, the FBI, the State Department, and anyone else who for even the briefest moment pushed back against his authority and omniscience. They allowed Trump's big lie that the election was stolen to poison the thinking of 70% of his voters, roughly 50 million Americans. The Senate's Republican members did not just fail, they betrayed their oaths of office, sacrificing American lives and American democracy. On January 20th, 2021, Joseph R. Biden, Jr. became President of the United States. Could Biden, a man of unmatched government experience and unquestioned decency, bring our country back together? Would the Senate work with a president who was one of the most experienced former senators in the history of the chamber? McConnell, who had known Biden for more than 35 years, waited 5 weeks after the election to offer his congratulations. Lindsey Graham, who has an over-the-top opinion about every subject, said in 2019, "If you can't admire Joe Biden as a person, you've got a problem and need to do some self-education, because God never created a better human being than Joe Biden." His immediate response to Biden's election was to resume the pursuit of the president-elect's son, Hunter Biden, for alleged misdeeds and business dealings in Ukraine and China. I have spent much of my career working in and writing about the Senate. It often seems to me that I have spent too much time thinking about the Senate. It took me months to decide whether to write this book. Ultimately, 2 things convinced me to do it. The Senate, and the 100 men and women who serve in it, has the potential to do great good or great harm to our country. It is crucial to understand how things went terribly wrong in recent years and how the institution might move on to a better course. And in an era of alternative facts, it is vital to get the history right. Future students of history and politics need to understand how Mitch McConnell and his Senate betrayed America. Many political observers, ranging from casual to experienced, believe that the partisan division in the Senate and the behavior of the senators are inevitable, given the deep divisions in our country. I categorically reject that formulation. These people, who have the extraordinary privilege of being U.S. senators, have the responsibility to work to overcome those divisions, not simply to reflect or exacerbate them. Senators have agency. They can shape the times, not simply be buffeted by them. To take the most obvious example, McConnell's unrelenting partisanship has shaped our era because he passed up every opportunity to work constructively in good faith, to turn down the heat, and to bring people together. Years before Donald Trump became president, we were living in Mitch McConnell's America, and, to a greater extent than might have been anticipated, we still are. America has paid a terrible price for the experiment with Trump, a narcissistic outsider and disruptor, with authoritarian impulses and contempt for our democratic institutions. But it is McConnell, the political stalwart and faux institutionalist, who poisoned and undermined our political system from within, transforming the Senate into a hyper-partisan battle zone, draining it of the trust and pride that made it work in its great days, while using it for his own purposes. The scope of the damage that McConnell has done to our government, our politics, and our country is still not understood. This book is intended to cast light on that damage and to chart a better path forward for the Senate and for America. 1. The End of the Last Great Senate. In 2015, former Senate leaders Tom Daschle and Trent Lott published a book called Crisis Point: Why We Must, and How We Can, Overcome Our Broken Politics in Washington and Across America. Daschle and Lott represented the epitome of Washington's political establishment. After a combined 59 years in Congress, they continued to work in the nation's capital as strategic advisors, lobbyists, board members, and leading participants in the Bipartisan Policy Center. Lott, the Senate Majority Leader from 1996 to 2001, came from a sharecropper family in Mississippi, and one of his earliest political activities was lobbying in favor of maintaining the racial segregation of his fraternity at Ole Miss. He was one of the first generation of Southern Republicans who capitalized on popular opposition to civil rights to turn the South red. Daschle, a Democrat who succeeded Lott as Senate Majority Leader, serving from 2001 to 2004, was a former Air Force intelligence officer who won his seat in Congress in a prairie populist state that had previously elected George McGovern, the 1972 Democratic presidential nominee. It is impossible today to imagine Senate leaders from opposite sides of the aisle, say Mitch McConnell and Charles Schumer, writing a book together. But Daschle and Lott were from a different generation. They had worked together amicably and were aghast at the vicious partisan divide that had come to characterize the Senate in the years since they had left office. They had many reasons, as active lobbyists, not to be critical of Capitol Hill, and they had a natural reluctance to criticize their successors as Senate leaders. Consequently, their unflinching indictment carried an extra force. America's strength has always come from its unique diversity, its willingness to not just permit but to encourage competing viewpoints in order to strengthen the whole. The adversarial system, embedded by the Founding Fathers into our system of government, was meant to spur debate, challenge complacency, and drive progress. It has sustained our republic for over 225 years, but we have to face a sad truth. It has stopped working. Daschle and Lott's anguish assessment was widely shared by journalists, historians, the senators themselves, and the American public. Despite their different vantage points, they all saw the federal government failing the American people. Congress lurched from crisis to crisis, unable to pass a budget and appropriations law to run the country, forced instead to resort to last-minute omnibus continuing resolutions. In each Congress, the number of laws passed declined. The number of filibusters increased. Increasingly ineffectual Congresses ceded more and more power to the President and ultimately to the Supreme Court. Talented legislative dealmakers from both parties quit in frustration. Public approval of Congress, declining since the 1960s, spiraled downward as more and more Americans concluded that Washington worked only to protect and further the interests of the wealthiest. Daschle and Lott recognized that the Senate had become ground zero for America's political dysfunction, the political institution that had failed America the longest and the worst. The Senate's failure was particularly crippling because it is supposed to be the balance wheel and moderating force in the American constitutional system, the place where the two parties come together to find common ground through vigorous debate and principled compromise to advance the national interest. The House of Representatives was designed to be the people's chamber, subject to short, 2-year terms that are apt to reflect changing passions and priorities. It had 65 members in 1790, a number that continued to grow with the population until 1929, when the House established its current size of 435 members. The Senate, with its 6-year terms and limit of 2 senators per state, was the elite chamber, what Walter Mondale once described as the nation's mediator, and Howard Baker called the nation's board of directors. But to perform that role, the Senate required a bipartisan committee that disappeared long ago. Without that bipartisan committee, the Senate not only reflects the polarization in the country, but also exacerbates that polarization by demonstrating it constantly at the highest and most visible level of government. The Senate's long decline has been acutely painful to a generation that grew up with a special attachment to it. The Senate first gained the attention of many Americans in 1939, with Frank Capra's film Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, starring Jimmy Stewart as an idealistic young senator who battles political corruption. The film, widely regarded as a classic, catapulted Stewart to stardom and captured 11 Academy Award nominations. It created in the mind of Americans an indelible image of what a filibuster should be, and more recent, real-life filibusters by Rand Paul or Ted Cruz would always draw unfavorable comparison to Stewart's valiant effort. But the Senate truly seized the attention of the American public in 1950, when Estes Kefauver, a little-known Democratic senator from Tennessee, launched an extraordinary series of investigative hearings into organized crime in America. The Kefauver hearings, as they became universally known, took place in 14 cities around the country. They illuminated the workings of the mafia and forced J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, to admit that organized crime was a national problem. Television was still very new in America, and the Kefauver hearings became the first nationally shared television experience, viewed by more than 30 million Americans in their homes, bars, restaurants, and movie theaters. At one time, an astonishing 72% of Americans expressed familiarity with the committee's work. During 8 days of hearings in New York in March 1951, more than 50 witnesses described the highest-ranking crime syndicate in America, an organization allegedly led by Frank Costello, who had taken over from Lucky Luciano. "The week of March 12, 1951, will occupy a special place in history," Life reported. People had suddenly gone indoors into living rooms, taverns and clubrooms, auditoriums and back offices. There, in eerie half-light, looking at millions of small frosty screens, people sat as if charmed. Never had the attention of the nation been riveted so completely on a single matter. Time wrote, "From Manhattan, as far west as the coaxial cable ran, the U.S. adjusted itself to Kefauver's schedule. Dishes stood in sinks, babies went unfed, business sagged, and department stores emptied while the hearings went on." The Senate continued to be a source of fascination through the 1950s. In 1954, the country again became enthralled by the Army McCarthy hearings, conducted by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, into Senator Joseph McCarthy's demagogic charges that the U.S. Army was infiltrated by communists. The hearings produced one of the most famous moments in American political history, when Joseph Welch, the Army's chief counsel, challenged the junior senator from Wisconsin, "At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" The dramatic exchange highlighted a hearing that sent McCarthy's popularity into a tailspin and opened the door to his censure by the Senate, ending the Red Scare that he had done so much to precipitate. In 1956, John F. Kennedy, a little-known Massachusetts senator, published the book Profiles in Courage, eloquently describing inordinate acts of political courage and sacrifice by 8 of his senatorial predecessors. Profiles in Courage would become one of the most indelible phrases in American life, and one of the best-known political books ever written, winning the Pulitzer Prize and springboarding Kennedy to national prominence. In 1959, Alan Drury, a New York Times reporter covering the Senate, wrote Advise and Consent, a novel about a brutal Senate confirmation fight over Robert Leffingwell, a liberal nominated to be Secretary of State. Advise and Consent became the most famous political novel ever written. It spent 112 weeks on the bestseller list, and the movie version, with memorable scenes of Senate floor debate and off-the-floor intrigue, captivated many Americans. In 2009, Thomas Mallon, writing for the New York Times Book Review, observed, 50 years later, most of the subject matter remains recognizable. Drury's 99 men and 1 lone woman wrestle with the issue of preemptive war, the degree of severity with which lying under oath must be viewed, and the way that the cover-up is invariably worse than the crime. Scott Simon of National Public Radio, writing in the Wall Street Journal, put it succinctly, 50 years after publication and astounding success, Alan Drury's novel remains the definitive Washington tale. By the end of the 1950s, many Americans found the Senate familiar and thought they understood it. the high-profile investigations, the all-night filibusters, the occasional acts of conscience, the behind-the-scenes intrigue. John Kennedy's glamour and rise to the presidency further bolstered the Senate's stand.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?